In 260 BC, a Carthaginian war captain patrolling the strait off the northern coast of Sicily saw something that made no sense to him at all. A fleet of Roman ships was bearing down on his squadron, and Rome, as every sailor in the Mediterranean knew perfectly well, did not have a navy. Rome was a land power, an army of farmers and legionaries that had never in its history won a battle at sea, that did not, a few years earlier, own a single warship capable of facing a Carthaginian quinquereme. And yet here they were, dozens of ships, crewed and armed, closing the distance with a strange contraption bolted to each bow. A kind of hinged wooden ramp tipped with an iron spike, raised into the air like a bird's beak. Nobody on the Carthaginian side had ever seen anything like it, and nobody was prepared for what it was about to do to more than 500 years of Mediterranean naval warfare. This was the fleet that would win the Battle of Mylae, Rome's first naval victory in its history, and the strange device on its bow was called the corvus. And the strangest part of the whole story is that this fleet, built almost overnight by a people who had no shipbuilding tradition at all, was assembled by copying, plank for plank, the hull of a single wrecked enemy ship. Rome, roughly 264 BC. If you had asked a Roman senator what kept him up at night, the sea would not have been high on the list. Rome had spent 2.5 centuries conquering the Italian peninsula on foot, legion by legion, and its entire military tradition was built around the idea that wars were won on land, by infantry, in formation. But the First Punic War changed the terms of the problem overnight. Carthage, a maritime trading empire built on centuries of naval experience, controlled Sicily's coastline. And Sicily's coastline was exactly what Rome needed to control if it wanted to keep the war going, move troops, and starve out Carthaginian garrisons. Every Roman legion that tried to cross the strait or resupply an army on the island depended entirely on ships, and Carthage owned the water. Roman convoys were being intercepted, Roman garrisons were being cut off, and no amount of infantry discipline meant anything if the enemy could simply sail around you. This wasn't a matter of ambition, it was a matter of the war being unwinnable without a fleet. And Rome, a civilization of soldiers, had absolutely no idea how to build one. Then, according to the historian Polybius, a Carthaginian quinquereme ran aground on the Italian coast while pursuing a Roman ship, more or less delivering itself into Roman hands. The Senate did something almost nobody else in that era would have thought to do. Instead of trying to design a warship from first principles, they used the wreck as a blueprint, copying its hull shape plank by plank, and then built well over 100 identical vessels at once, using standardized timber and prefabricated components so that different work crews could each build a piece and assemble the whole fleet in a matter of weeks. But copying the hull only solved half the problem. A Roman crew of farmers and legionaries turned sailors overnight could never outrow or outmaneuver a Carthaginian crew that had trained at sea since childhood. So Roman engineers added something no Mediterranean fleet had ever needed before: the corvus, a boarding bridge roughly 11 meters long, hinged to a pole on the bow, and armed with an iron spike on its underside. Once a Roman ship pulled alongside an enemy vessel, the corvus dropped, the spike bit into the enemy deck, and the naval battle simply stopped being a naval battle. It became an infantry battle on a floating platform, and infantry was the one thing at which no navy in the Mediterranean could beat Rome. At Mylae, the corvus let Roman marines storm ship after ship, and a fleet that had existed for barely 2 years destroyed a force crewed by some of the most experienced sailors in the ancient world. Here is the detail that gets lost every single time this era gets told as a story about Rome's inevitable rise to naval supremacy. Nobody in the Senate in 264 BC was drawing up plans to one day rule the entire Mediterranean coastline from Gibraltar to the Levant. They were trying to solve one specific, narrow problem. How do you win a war against a superior naval power when you have never built a warship in your life and don't have time to learn seamanship? The corvus and the copied hull were not a grand strategic vision. They were an improvised answer to an immediate crisis, and it happened to work so well that it reshaped the balance of power across an entire sea. And the fleet Rome built to win a war turned out to be only the beginning, because the exact same hull-building techniques that produced a quinquereme in a matter of weeks were also, it turned out, extraordinarily good at building cargo ships. Roman shipwrights built hulls by joining planks edge to edge with thousands of mortise and tenon joints, tight wooden tongues locked into matching slots and pinned in place, so that the planking itself formed a rigid shell strong enough to carry a hull's weight before a single internal frame was even added. A hull built this way could be enormous, and by the height of the empire, Rome needed enormous hulls. Because the city of Rome itself, swollen to nearly 1 million people, could not feed itself on Italian grain alone. Egypt and North Africa became the empire's breadbasket, and an entire fleet of merchant ships, the navis honoraria and the corbita, existed for one purpose: keeping the annona, the grain dole that kept the city fed and politically stable, flowing across the sea without interruption. The writer Lucian described one of these ships, the Isis, in the 2nd century AD, as a floating warehouse so large that its hull alone dwarfed anything a passerby at the docks of Piraeus had ever seen, carrying enough grain to feed the city of Athens for a year in a single voyage. Carrying that much cargo across open water for months at a time raised a problem no Mediterranean shipbuilder had fully solved before. How do you keep a wooden hull from rotting and being eaten alive by shipworm on a voyage that might last weeks? And how do you steer a ship that large with any precision? Roman engineers answered both questions. Hulls exposed to long voyages were sheathed in thin lead sheets nailed over a layer of tarred fabric, a barrier that kept Teredo navalis, the shipworm that could reduce an unprotected hull to sponge within a single season, from ever reaching the wood. Steering was handled not by a single rudder, but by a pair of large quarter rudders, broad steering oars mounted on each side of the stern and worked together, giving a helmsman far more control over a heavily loaded hull than a single oar ever could. And a small foresail, called the artemon, angled forward near the bow, let a captain adjust a ship's heading independently of its mainsail, making it possible to work a laden merchant ship into a harbor mouth under conditions that would have left an earlier generation of ships stranded offshore, waiting for a shift in the wind. And ringing the entire system together was a network of lighthouses, built on the model of the Pharos of Alexandria, standing at nearly every major Roman harbor from Ostia to Dover, so that a ship's captain approaching an unfamiliar coast at night had, for the first time in Mediterranean history, a fixed and reliable point of reference to steer toward. But this was only part of what these ships built, because alongside the grain and the wine and the olive oil, people began to move too. Roman veterans, discharged after decades in the legions, and merchants chasing the same trade routes their ships now sailed with total reliability, settled by the thousands in coastal colonies from southern Gaul to the coast of North Africa to the shores of the Black Sea. These were not haphazard settlements. They were coloniae, planned towns built to Roman specifications with the same grid streets, the same forums, the same harbors, wherever a reliable Roman merchant ship could reach. This was exactly the same logic that later turned the Norse ship into a tool for settling Iceland, or the junk into a tool for settling the coast of Southeast Asia. Once a vessel can predictably and safely cross open water, it stops being merely a trading tool and becomes a tool for relocating entire communities. And by the height of the empire, Roman citizens governed and traded in port cities on 3 continents entirely because a ship built to feed one city could reliably reach any of them. Ostia, the port at the mouth of the Tiber, became the clearest example of a trade route turning into a permanent center of imperial life. By the 2nd century AD, The harbor handled an almost continuous procession of grain ships from Alexandria, olive oil carriers from Spain, wine ships from Gaul, and passenger vessels carrying officials, soldiers, and travelers from every corner of the Mediterranean world, all converging on a stretch of coastline that a few centuries earlier had been little more than a fishing village. Warehouses stretched for kilometers along the riverbank. A corporation of ship owners, the Naviculari, operated under direct state contracts to guarantee the grain supply never failed, and Ostia effectively became the harbor through which an empire of 60 million people was fed, clothed, and supplied, made possible precisely because a Roman cargo ship could cross the open sea between Alexandria and Italy in a matter of weeks, season after season, with a predictability no earlier Mediterranean power had ever achieved. Then, in 40 AD, centuries of accumulated Roman shipbuilding skill converged into a project almost absurd in its ambition. The Emperor Caligula wanted to bring an Egyptian obelisk, a single quarried block of granite weighing several hundred tons, from Heliopolis to Rome to decorate a circus, and doing so meant building a ship larger than anything the Mediterranean had produced before. A vessel whose ballast alone, according to the writer Pliny the Elder, consisted of hundreds of tons of lentils packed into its hold to balance the obelisk's weight during the crossing. The ship made the voyage successfully and was later sunk deliberately at Ostia to serve as the foundation for one of the harbor's great breakwaters, its hull staying in place, quite literally holding up the empire's busiest port, for centuries after the obelisk itself had been raised in Rome. It was a fitting, almost accidental monument to what this shipbuilding tradition, born out of a desperate wartime improvisation 2 centuries earlier, had become capable of. Not just winning a war or feeding a city, but physically moving a piece of a mountain across the sea because an emperor wanted it in his capital. But of everything this tradition of shipbuilding achieved, nothing marked its turning point quite as sharply as a naval battle fought 600 years later, in 655 AD, off the coast of Lycia. By this point, the western half of the Roman Empire had already collapsed, and the eastern half, the empire modern historians call Byzantine, but which its own subjects still called Roman, remained the one power in the Mediterranean whose navy could trace its lineage in an unbroken line back to the fleet that had first learned to build a corvus. That lineage met a fleet from the newly expanding Arab Caliphate, built in Egyptian and Levantine shipyards that had only recently come under Muslim control. And in the battle that followed, remembered by Byzantine chroniclers as the Battle of the Masts, the Roman fleet suffered a defeat so severe that the emperor himself, aboard his flagship, reportedly escaped only by swapping clothes with a common sailor. It was the first time in over 800 years that a rival power had beaten a Roman fleet decisively enough to contest control of open water, and it marked the beginning of the end of unbroken Roman naval dominance over the sea, that Romans themselves had once simply called Mare Nostrum, our sea. What followed was not a single dramatic collapse, but a slow convergence of political and economic forces that quietly dismantled the world this shipbuilding tradition had built. As Arab fleets, and later the rising Italian maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, absorbed and adapted elements of the old Roman and Byzantine designs, the unified Mediterranean trading system that had once let a single grain ship sail unmolested from Alexandria to Ostia fractured into competing, often hostile spheres of control. Shipwrights, meanwhile, were quietly abandoning the old technique altogether. Archaeologists studying Mediterranean wrecks from the centuries after the fall of Rome can track, almost year by year, the mortise and tenon joints that had once locked a hull's planking into a single rigid shell, growing sparser and further apart, generation after generation, until, by roughly the 11th century, shipbuilders across the Mediterranean had largely abandoned shell-first construction altogether in favor of building a skeleton of frames first and nailing the planking onto it afterward,
a faster, cheaper method that no longer needed a workforce trained in a craft the Roman world had spent centuries perfecting.
The ships themselves did not disappear overnight. Byzantine shipyards continued building on Roman naval principles for centuries afterward, producing the dromon, a long, narrow galley that dominated the eastern Mediterranean well into the medieval period and carried Greek fire, one of the most feared weapons of its age, into battle against Arab and later Italian fleets. Merchant ships, built along lines a Roman shipwright would still have recognized, continued carrying grain and oil around the Mediterranean for generations after the Western Empire had fallen. What changed was not the ship, but the political and economic system that had once made a single, unbroken network of shipping lanes, running the length of an entire sea under one authority, possible in the first place. For centuries, almost everything the modern world knew about what these ships actually looked like below the waterline came from written descriptions, a handful of relief carvings, and the accounts of writers like Lucian and Pliny, none of whom had ever personally inspected a hull's timber. That changed in the 1970s and early 1980s, when a team of French archaeologists excavated the wreck of a Roman merchant ship off the Gien Peninsula, known today as the Madrague de Gien, a vessel that had sunk fully loaded with wine amphorae sometime around 60 BC and settled almost perfectly intact into the seabed mud. For the first time, scholars could measure, plank by plank, exactly how a Roman shipwright had cut and fitted thousands of mortise and tenon joints to build a hull strong enough to carry more than 400 tons of cargo without a single internal frame holding it together during construction. An earlier, far stranger discovery had already hinted at just how far Roman shipbuilding ambition could go. In 1929, engineers drained part of Lake Nemi outside Rome and raised two of Caligula's colossal pleasure barges, floating palaces complete with marble floors, heated baths, and bronze plumbing. Ships built purely for imperial luxury on a lake barely large enough to hold them. Tragically, both vessels, having survived intact under the lake for 19 centuries, were destroyed by fire in 1944 during fighting near the end of the Second World War, and today they survive mostly in photographs. And the story doesn't end in a museum display case. In 2004 and 2005, a team of German and Dutch archaeologists and shipwrights built full-scale functioning reconstructions of Roman river patrol boats, the Lusuriae once stationed along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, using nothing but tools, joints, and materials a Roman shipwright would have recognized, and then rowed them down both rivers to test exactly how these vessels handled current, cargo, and long-distance travel. The boats performed, by every account, remarkably well, moving swiftly and stably along the same waterways Roman legions had patrolled some 17 centuries earlier, using precisely the same hull logic that had first been improvised in a matter of weeks to beat a Carthaginian fleet off the coast of Sicily. This brings the whole story back to where it started, to a stretch of water off the northern coast of Sicily in 260 BC, and to a Carthaginian captain who had never seen anything like the strange, spiked ramp bearing down on his ship's deck. Nobody in the Roman Senate that authorized copying a wrecked enemy hull ever set out to one day feed a city of 1 million people, plant Roman towns on 3 continents, or drag a piece of a mountain across the sea to decorate a circus in the capital. They were trying to solve a much smaller problem: how to win a war at sea against an enemy who had been sailing for centuries, while Rome had been sailing for weeks. They solved it with a copied hull and an iron spike on a hinge, and in doing so, they accidentally built the vessel that would carry an empire's grain, an empire's citizens, and eventually an empire's ambitions across an entire sea for the better part of 1,000 years. The age of unchallenged Roman naval power did not end in a single defeat, but in a slow convergence of politics and rot on tenon joints that stretched across centuries. And the ships that carried it are still being raised from the floor of the Mediterranean today, and every time one comes up largely intact, it tells the same story again: a captured hull, copied plank by plank, and a foggy stretch of water off Sicily where something no one had ever seen before came into view.